everyone, this is the Chapter 8 video for the Instrument Ground School. So Chapter 8 is all about the FARs, the Federal Aviation Regulations. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and Rod points this out, FARs, a lot of people don't love the FARs, all right? One thing you should definitely realize, often we say that regulations are written in blood. Somebody got hurt or someone got dead and they made up a rule trying to prevent that from happening again. So there are good reasons to follow the FARs. Now, Rod spends a lot of time going over FARs that should be reviewed for you from your private pilot ground school. Starting with 61 definitions and some other things like what do you have to fly. Hopefully you know this already. You need to have your pilot certificate, a picture ID that's government issued, and your medical certificate, or if you're flying under basic med, you have to have your information for basic med. He spends a little bit of time talking about logging time and logging things in your logbook. He has this little aside on page 8-2. He talks about, can I log IFR time and PIC time? And the answer is yes. If you're flying with an instructor, you can log that time as PIC time and as instrument time if you're in actual instrument conditions as well. You might say, but I can't be PIC when I'm in actual instrument conditions. That's my instructor, and that's correct. However, it's also correct that you're the sole manipulator of the controls. So you might not be the legal PIC of the flight, but you can log PIC time. The other thing that he talks about is having a safety pilot. Having a safety pilot is one of those strange situations where you can have two private pilots and they can both log PIC time. So if you're the legal PIC, you can log PIC time because, if you're the legal PIC as a safety pilot, you can log flight time, and the actual pilot flying can also log PIC time. So it's an interesting situation that we have there. Okay, and then Rod talks a little bit about what is instrument time. Instrument time is time that you spend flying solely by reference to instruments. That is an interesting one, and it's a little bit gray, and this is something a lot of people will say, well, when do I log actual instrument time? What if I'm flying and I'm above a cloud layer? Well, can you still fly visually? Yeah, because you're not in the cloud layer. Well, what if the cloud layer is extremely sloped or jagged and I have to use my instruments? Maybe. There's a lot of iffiness there. Typically on an instrument flight, you're going to go in and out of instrument conditions. I mean, I've had a few flights where I've pretty much been in it the entire flight. I can recall a flight I had with one of my flight instructors some years back. He was working on getting his double I, and we took off in our trusty Alaris, and we flew for 2 hours, and we were in the clouds for 2 complete hours straight. And at one point he actually turned to me and he said, it's kind of like flying a video game, because it was. I mean, it was nice, light instrument conditions. There was just clouds. There wasn't any significant weather or nasty turbulence or anything. We were just in the clouds the whole time. So that does occasionally happen. So logging actual instrument time, then you get questions like, well, okay, I was flying an approach and I went through the clouds. How much instrument time is that? I was in and out. Some people, they'll say, I went through a cloud, there's a 10th. It's all pretty gray, exactly how you log it. Now, of course, simulated instrument time is a lot simpler. Put on the foggles or a hood, you start your timer then, and that's simulated instrument time. And Rod does make the point that if you could navigate without using the instruments, you probably shouldn't log it as an instrument time. You could, if we allow that, then we would have a lot of student pilots for logging instrument time because they don't look outside like they're supposed to. So speaking of safety pilots, if you have a safety pilot and they're flying with you, you need to record their information. So you have to say, okay, this is the person I flew with. They have to have at least a private pilot for the same category of aircraft. They have to have a medical certificate or fly under basic med. Other things, logging your time. In order to stay instrument current, you need to do 6 approaches within the last 6 months, or actually within the preceding 6 calendar months. So in a sense, you really got 7 months. If you do those approaches and you're, flying in actual weather, that's great. You just log it, and you're done. If you fly with a safety pilot, you need to include that information. In general, when you fly an instrument approach, you need to include what kind of approach you flew. So if I fly an instrument flight, just yesterday was up for a little instrument flight, and we flew over to Wilkes-Barre, we flew the ILS runway 22 approach, we went out, did some holds, and then we flew to Hazleton, we did the localizer 28 approach in Hazleton, came back to Bloomsburg, and in Bloomsburg we flew the GPS Bravo approach back into Bloomsburg. Right? So if you look in that student's logbook, you will see all 3 of those explicitly listed. It's going to say these are the approaches we flew. So whether you flew it with an instructor, by yourself, or with a safety pilot, you need to say these are the approaches I flew. Okay, so now what? What if you didn't get those 6 approaches within 6 months? There is now a 6-month grace period. So you have 6 months to complete those 6 approaches and get current again. Those 6 approaches you can do with a safety pilot in VFR conditions only. Right? You can't say, oh, well, I'm just a little bit out. Let me go up in actual conditions and go fly an approach. It doesn't work like that. So you've got 6 months to go fly your 6 approaches with a safety pilot, and you're still good. Of course, you could fly those 6 approaches with a flight instructor, and you don't have to worry so much about is it actual instrument conditions or not. Okay, so you've got your 6 approaches within 6 months. You don't make that, you got a 6-month grace period. And what if you're past that? You're a year out of date. Well, now you can do an instrument proficiency check where you get with a double I and you do certain representative tasks from your instrument check ride. One of those is going to include a circling approach to a landing. You do that and you're done. So you don't have to do 6 approaches in the IPC, by the way. In theory, you can get it done with 2 or 3 approaches, depending on which approaches they are. That's something that I've actually done with other instructors in maybe a half hour of flight time each, if you pick the right places. Other things that Rod talks about. He talks about being PIC. What does it mean to be pilot in command? It means to be in charge. He mentions the fact that don't be afraid to do things like declare an emergency. I remember one time I was flying into a towered field in Atlanta, in McCollum Field in Cobb County, where I used to be based. And I was in the pattern with a student, and somebody called up and they said, I have an imminent engine failure. And the controller said, well, why do you say you have an imminent engine failure? And he said, well, my windscreen is covered in oil and I have no oil pressure. So, it sounded like it was pretty much an emergency. The controllers asked him, do you want to declare an emergency? And he said, no, I think I'm okay. That is what we call stupid. Right? Don't be stupid. If you have an emergency, declare an emergency. Declaring an emergency allows the controllers to pretty much let you do whatever you want to deal with that emergency. It gives them carte blanche to just let you do your own thing. So that is declaring an emergency. Some people don't want to do it. They're afraid they're going to have to do some paperwork. That almost never happens. And even if it does, so what? They can request you to provide information about your emergency. I don't think they actually do that very much. I'm not aware of anyone where they came at them later, and it's not even a malicious thing, where they even said, hey, please provide the conditions whereby you felt like you had to declare an emergency. And even if they look at that and they say, well, he probably really didn't need to do this, nothing bad is going to happen to you, right? Nobody else was there. You were the one in that situation, so you're the one that has to make the determination if it's an emergency or not. And I don't know anyone that's ever been, gone after by the FAA or anybody else because they declared an emergency that, they thought it was, and maybe it really wasn't. Some of the other FARs that Rod talks about, those are pretty much relevant to VFR flight. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those. Things like what's your minimum safe altitudes when you're flying around. You can feel free to read that in your book. Clearances, he's talking about that in 91-123. So once you have a clearance, you can't deviate from the clearance unless you tell them or unless you do it for safety, and then you tell them about it later. Again, aviate, navigate, communicate. There's nothing wrong with deviating, and if the frequency is busy, you can tell them later. I can think of a time where I got vectored, I say. They forgot about me, and they set me right into like a level 4 thunderstorm cell, and I'm flying along and my little Alaris just getting pounded, and vertical speed was, plus minus 1,500 feet. It was just crazy, really bad, and I ended up, I passed an airport nearby, which I could see below me in the clouds. There was a little break there, and I actually, the frequency was super busy. I ended up deciding to turn around because I was a little bit concerned about all the turbulence I was in and some of the other things. So I turned around and started heading toward that airport, and they suddenly remembered me again because they were looking at their radar display and thinking, oh, well, this guy's got his altitudes all over the place, and his direction changed. I turned toward the airport and then had to adjust. And so when they finally called me back, they were like, do you have ground reference? Can you see the ground? And I'm like, yeah, I can see the ground. They probably thought that I had lost it. I can see it intermittently, but I told them, hey, I'm diverting to this other airport. They're like, okay. So again, follow your clearance. If there's a good reason not to follow your clearance, if you can tell them about it right away, do it. You can also say that you are unable, right? If someone says, hey, I want you to fly over here, we were talking about instrument flight plans before in the previous chapter. Maybe they change your routing and they're going to fly you right over Lake Michigan or some other huge body of water. You can say, I can't take that clearance. I don't have a flotation gear. I can't legally take that clearance. So you are allowed to reject a clearance. So things to keep in mind. When talking about ATC, IFR, canceling IFR, ATC will never tell you to cancel IFR. They pretty much are not allowed to tell you, but they might kind of remind you, hey, if you're in VFR conditions, you can cancel on the ground or you can cancel with me. If you're coming in VFR conditions, if you're encountering VFR conditions toward the end of your flight, it's not a bad thing to cancel IFR. You don't have any radio transmission range, and it's hard to cancel. However, be careful. Don't cancel if you're in instrument condition. There have been people that got in trouble because they came in and they were like, well, I'm going to help people out. I'm going to cancel IFR early, and they landed in instrument conditions, and then they got busted. In one case, there was actually an FAA guy at the airport on the ground who came out and busted him and said, hey, you canceled IFR when you were still below VFR minimums. So be careful about that. Now, earlier in the last chapter, we talked about non-towered fields and how there was that void time for your clearance. Why is there that void time? Because you're not under positive control. There is a space around the airport. There's like a little cylinder, if you will, or a protected area where the approaches are coming into that airport. And there's only one person at a time that's allowed into that area. So again, if it is a VFR day and there are multiple people going into that airport, it's not such a bad thing if you cancel IFR earlier. But again, air traffic control is not going to offer that to you. It's something you're going to have to ask them for. They might kind of give you some hints, but they're not allowed to say, hey, you want to cancel IFR right now? It just doesn't work like that. Okay, Rod talks a lot about different kinds of airspace. Not going to go over there. You should know that already. Feel free to review that. He does talk about special VFR. And the only reason I want to bring up special VFR is because as an instrument pilot, this is something you can do at night. At nighttime, you can request a special VFR clearance only if you're instrument rated, instrument current, and instrument equipped. You're not allowed to do this if you're a VFR only pilot. I actually had a flight review once where we were flying at night and I was coming in with my student who was not yet instrument rated. We were coming into a towered field in Atlanta, Fulton County. And so we were coming in, we're listening to ATIS, and sure enough, the field went IFR. We thought, well, that's really odd. We could see the beacon at the airport. So we called them up, said, well, the field is IFR, what do you want to do? And we said, well, why don't we get a special VFR? So later I asked my student, I said, hey, could you have gotten a special VFR by yourself? And he's like, sure. It's like, okay, could you legally have gotten that by yourself? And the answer was no. By the way, here's what happened. It was an interesting flight. Everything was great. We came in, we could see the airport. We came in and landed. And as soon as we landed, we were just like in the fog. There was this layer of fog that was from the ground to about 50 feet. And above that, there's like a little body of water nearby, and it just kind of blown over. Above that, you could see just great. Nice clear skies, nice clear night even. So once we landed, we had a really hard time finding the taxiways to get off the runway and to get to parked. We went really slow and eventually could see the blue lights for the taxiways, and we had GPS as well, kind of cranked up the resolution on that, and we were able to make our way back to our parking space. So that's special VFR at night. It's only for instrument pilots. One thing you will notice, you have to be instrument rated and instrument current, but your aircraft doesn't say your aircraft has to be instrument qualified. In other words, it doesn't have to have its current instrument certifications. Other things that are pertinent to instrument pilots. If you're a VFR pilot and you're flying somewhere, you have to have enough fuel during the day to fly to your destination or your first point of intended landing, plus 30 minutes at cruise. If it's IFR, you have to have enough fuel to go to your destination, plus 45 minutes. And if there's an alternate, you have to be able to fly to your destination and your alternate and fly an approach and still have 45 minutes. So that's another difference. You need extra fuel, and then sometimes you have to file an alternate. So when are these times that you need to file an alternate? I'm glad you asked. So we have what we call the 1, 2, 3 rule. So within an hour before your arrival at your destination, you have to have 2,000 foot ceilings or more and 3 miles visibility or more. So that's the 1, 2, 3 rule. If you don't have this, you have to file an alternate. Now, this alternate situation is the source of a lot of confusion, but here are the conditions for when do I have to file an alternate. within an hour before to an hour after if the forecast is not for at least 2K ceilings and at least 3 miles visibility, I have to file an alternate. Now, when I file an alternate, Rod talks about paper alternates and real alternates. Something to realize, your alternate, you are not required to actually ever go there. You just have to have enough fuel to get there. Let's say you were going into Bloomsburg, and our approaches here are not honestly all that great. You actually have to be better than VFR. The lowest altitude for the approaches in here is above the traffic pattern altitude because of the terrain. So, there's not the best situation. There are some days where you might want to go fly IFR from Bloomsburg, and you'll say, all right, well, it's a great practice day, but then you're like, it's kind of iffy. I might not get back in here. I might have to go somewhere else. That's the way it is. So, what's your alternate going to be? Well, there's the paper alternate, which could be the alternate that you would actually fly to, but again, nobody says you have to go there. Maybe the weather isn't forecast to be really good in the region, and I want to list an alternate as Philadelphia. If I have enough fuel to get there, that's okay. But maybe I could go to Williamsport or Wilkes-Barre or even Allentown, and I'd be just as good, and that's acceptable. So a little bit about your alternate. So the alternate has to have decent weather, right? You can't just file an alternate that has weather that's just as bad as your destination. That doesn't make any sense. So if your alternate has a non-precision approach, you need to have 800 foot, at least 800 feet, and at least 2 miles visibility. So that's what you need to have. Now, here's the thing that's sometimes confusing. This is at the time you expect to arrive, not plus or minus an hour, just at the time that you should arrive there. So it doesn't have this huge window. If they have a precision approach, then you can get away with a little bit less. You can go with 600 foot ceiling and 2 miles visibility. Okay, so a little bit more about the paper alternate versus your real alternate. You might have to go a little ways to find weather that's this good. 600 feet, 2 miles visibility, or 800 feet, 2 miles visibility. However, if you had, let's say, 500 feet at Wilkes-Barre, very doable. ILS approach normally brings you down to 200 feet, mile visibility, sometimes less. So can you divert to Wilkes-Barre if it's 500 overcast and 1.5 miles visibility? Hopefully. In theory, you should be able to do that. It's certainly within the approach minimums for that airport. So, other strange things for alternates. There is this allowance for having an alternate that is not even one with an instrument approach at all. You might say, what? Well, believe it or not, you can have an airport listed as an alternate where there's no approaches, but if you can descend from the MEA, the minimum en route altitude nearby, if you can descend VFR to the airport, you can list it as an alternate. So another thing, I can't think of a time where I ever did this, and honestly I don't know anybody that's done this, but it is allowed. Why don't I know anyone that's done this? Most airports have an instrument approach. Even if it's not a great one, a lot of them will have an instrument approach. I say that, I know that there are some that have no instrument approaches, like Smoketown is a good example. There's no approaches there, but it's also 6 miles away from Lancaster. Okay, so more about alternates. When I look at a chart, when I look at an instrument approach plate, I might see a little triangle with an A in it. I might see above it a little triangle with a T. We'll talk about that later. But the A means that this has alternate minimums that are non-standard. In other words, not 800-2 or 600-2. If I look at the front of the approach plate book, it will tell me what those non-standard minimums are. So if you look at figure 29 in your book, he has Palm Springs, and it says categories A, B, 1302, category C and D, 1303. So that's how good the weather has to be to list that as an alternate, not the standard. Let's see, what kind of approach is that? It's a VOR approach, it's non-precision approach. So instead of being 802, it's 1302 or 1303, depending on how fast you're going. I realize we haven't talked about approach plates, what they look like yet. Welcome to the world of aviation, where everything is intertwined. Right? So it's hard to completely explain one thing without knowing something about the other. Think back to private pilot. We're trying to talk about regulations in airspace, and we haven't talked about airspace, we haven't talked about regulations, we haven't talked about charts. And so all these things are kind of intertwined, and it's hard to talk about them in isolation. Okay, let's talk about instrument checks. In order to fly IFR, if you're going to use something like a VOR, your VOR has to be checked in 30 days. So we'll start with that. How can you check a VOR? There's a couple of ways. You can use a VOT. VOT is a facility that sends out just the north radial. You can dial your radio to the frequency, set it on north, and hopefully your needle will center. So you want to center the needle, and you're allowed plus or minus 4 degrees on a VOT. Kind of related to a VOT, you don't see a lot of these, is a ground checkpoint, which is also plus or minus 4 degrees. How does that work? You'll see a sign that says, at this point, if you dial in this frequency, you should be on this radial. By the way, these VOR checks are supposed to be in a written log somewhere, and you have to say who did the check, when they did the check, and what kind of check they did. So which of these different VOR checks we're going to describe did you perform on that date? And there's a signature in the log. This could be something on the back of whatever, maybe a log that you use to keep track of your flight time in your airplane. Maybe it's a club plane, a small group of people, a partnership, whatever. So those are two common ways that you can check. There are also some airborne checkpoints. So an airborne checkpoint, you got to be within plus or minus 6 degrees. You can also make your own checkpoint. You do a DIY checkpoint, again plus or minus 6 degrees. You can pick a prominent landmark, figure out what radial you should be on if you're over it. Don't pick a nuclear power plant, by the way, or something you're not supposed to be flying over all the time. Again, you get plus or minus 6 degrees. And one of the more popular checks, if you have two VORs, you can do the dual VOR check. You can check them against each other as long as they're independent and possibly only share an antenna. You can't share anything else. You have to be within 4 degrees. Notice it's not plus or minus 4 degrees. They have to indicate the same radial within 4 degrees. So if one of them says 360, the other one can say 4, can say 356. They can't say 355. They have to be within 4 degrees of each. Okay, Rod talks about taking off and landing IFR. When you're landing IFR, you have to fly in instrument conditions, of course, a published instrument approach. You can't make up your own, as much as some of you might like to. I know someone that kind of made up his own. Technically not legal to fly it, and at least not in instrument conditions. So when you come down, there's going to be a minimum altitude for your approach. Now, that's either going to be called a DA, a decision altitude, or an MDA, minimum descent altitude. Again, we'll get into this when we start talking about approaches. But the rules are, you can't go below this minimum altitude unless you can see something. And you're like, well, what can I see? Hopefully, a runway. So there are some conditions that must exist to go below this. So if I want to go below that, I need to have 3 conditions. So condition 1, I'm in a position where descent is safe, basically. I can safely make a descent using a normal rate of descent and normal. In other words, if I just popped out of the clouds, I'm at the runway threshold, I'm 1,000 foot in the air. Yeah, I don't think I can make a safe descent using normal procedures. So I probably need to do a go-around or something else. Condition 2, the flight visibility has to be greater than what the approach says, the approach minimum. How do I know what that is? That's a good question, because there's no good way to measure it. You know, sometimes you'll have the ground visibility that's reported by ATIS. Sometimes you'll have something called RVR, runway visual range. None of that matters. You have to have so much flight visibility in order to land. Hard to judge, but it is a condition. Okay, and number 3, you have to have something in sight. If you have the approach lighting system in sight, you can go down another 100 feet, if that's all you have. And then you have to be able to see other things on this list. Runway threshold, or threshold marks, or threshold lights, or end identifier lights, or the VASI, or PAPI, or touchdown zone marking, or touchdown zone lights, or runway, or finally runway lights. Okay, so Rod makes the point, why is it that I can only go down another 100 feet if I can only see this? And the reason for that, this is before the runway threshold, all the rest of this stuff is after the runway threshold. So if I can see something after the runway threshold, I'm good. If I can only see the lights, I can go down another 100 feet, and that's it. Okay, then Rod talks about minimum IFR altitudes. Basically speaking, you have to be at least 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle within a horizontal distance of 4 miles. You have to be 2,000 feet above anything within 4 miles if you're in a mountainous region. Now, if you look at figure 42 in your book, Rod will show you where the mountainous regions are, and guess what? Nearly the entire state of Pennsylvania is a mountainous region. There's a little corner down in the southeast that isn't. But the rest of it, like us, this is a mountainous region. So you're going to see a lot of higher altitudes. Okay, and then we talk about IFR radio communications. Now, when you're talking to ATC, if you're not in radar coverage, you're out away from any city or whatever, maybe you're just too low, then you have to report time and altitude at designated reporting points. That's the rule. Now, what about when you're in radar coverage? You only report what ATC asked for. They said, report this point. Report your final approach fixed inbound, whatever it is. You report that. That's it. Pretty simple. Okay, what about losing communication? This is a big topic, definitely something you're going to see on your knowledge test and something you're going to get asked about on your check ride. Guaranteed. So you've lost your communications. What are you going to do? Well, if your VFR, continue, VFR, land, and land as soon as feasible. That one's pretty easy. If you're in IFR conditions, you can, if possible, squawk 7600. So if you're not in VFR condition. Quick story, I was flying with somebody once, and we were flying in instrument conditions, but we knew if we descended a little bit, we would be out of the clouds. And how did we know that? We knew that we would be out of the clouds because we were occasionally going out of the clouds. We were kind of in and out, plus we were getting beat to death. because of all the turbulence from flying along the bottom of a cloud. So we had a total electrical failure. We were flying around Atlanta and in the clouds, as I said, and I remember thinking, hey, we haven't heard from ATC for a while. And about that time they called us and we keyed the mic to respond and the entire instrument stack went dark. Well, what had happened was the alternator had failed, a wire actually broke on it, and we didn't notice that things weren't getting charged because this was a 1960s era Cessna, and the little metal plate in the back ammeter had fallen forward and kind of locked the needle in place. So it looked like we were getting a charge when we weren't. So as soon as we tried to key the mic, there's a lot more power required for that than there is for receiving. And it just said, oh, we're done here. We lost all the electric. So we ended up descending a little bit. I actually had a handheld VFR GPS with me, and I was able to figure out where we were. It took a little while to get a fix though, because it was a Cessna and high wings, blocking the signals and all that. And you're going 130 knots, it's a little bit hard to get a fix. So I eventually got a fix, and we were able to go to an airport. We landed under VFR conditions, and then we called up flight service and told them, hey, here's what happened, we landed over here. Wasn't a big deal. So if you can continue the flight VFR, do it. That's number one. Well, what if you can't? Hopefully you're not losing your comms because you just had a total electrical failure. Rod mentions the most common reason that people lose the comms is they turn down the volume on the radio and they forget to turn it back up, or they're listening to the wrong thing. They have their audio panel set incorrectly. It happens. Okay, so if you're going to go IFR, there are three things you have to consider. Your route, your altitude, and then there's the timing. So let's start with the route. What route should you fly? Last assigned. And hopefully that's good enough. Now, you may not have gotten a clearance all the way to your destination. So what are you going to do? Well, if I've been cleared to a fix, go directly to that fix. What does direct mean? Direct. You got GPS direct to that fix. That's the route. If they told you to expect a route, they told you go here, expect this, then do that. And if none of these two make any sense, then the route you filed. So that's the route. What about your altitudes? You need to fly the highest of last assigned, minimum IFR altitude. So what does the minimum IFR altitude mean? It depends. It could be the minimum vectoring altitude. It could be the minimum en route altitude if you're on an airway. And again, these are things that we haven't talked about yet. Or the one you were told to expect. So back to, before we said you depart an airport, they say climb and maintain 3,000, expect 6,000. Right? So you're going to keep on going up to 6,000 feet if you lost your comms. And then there's the timing. If you're at a hold, leave the hold at the expect further clearance time. And if you're not in a hold, and if you look at page 834 in your book, there's a couple of paragraphs talking all about this stuff. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'd recommend you read it over. But, it's like 2 paragraphs from the regs and then a couple pages of Rod describing. So yeah, there's a lot packed in there. Now, basically, if you're in a hold, leave the hold and expect further clearance time. This is assuming this is a hold. It's part of, let's say, your initial approach fix. It's part of an approach. Or you can do a published approach from that point. Leave at your expect further clearance time. Otherwise, try to arrive at your filed time. You said it was going to be 47 minutes for this flight, and you took off at 9 o'clock. So at 9:47, you should try to arrive at the airport about 9:40. Thankfully, They'll probably get you on radar, at least primary radar, if nothing else, if you have a total electrical failure. And then they'll be able to get other people out of your way. They're pretty good at stuff like that. Okay, a couple of miscellaneous things. What if you're in controlled airspace and you have some sort of equipment malfunction? You're required to give them your ID, so your airplane ID, basically, tail number, what failed, and how is it going to affect you? Oh, I just lost both of my VORs and I'm doing an ILS approach. Well, that's bad. I lost my second VOR, but I seem to be okay. And assistance. How much assistance do you need? I lost both my VORs, but my comms are still working. Maybe I'm working on a handheld comm. I'm having a real bad day, right? I'm thinking I'm really glad I bought that little handheld unit and threw it in my bag. Maybe I'm going to ask them for a no gyro approach. Who knows? Right? So these are the things you're required to tell them if you're encountering malfunctions in controlled airspace. Equipment. What do you need to fly IFR? VFR equipment plus tomato flames, however you remember that stuff from your private pilot ground school. You need that. Plus you need two-way radios. You have to be able to talk. You need a turn coordinator or a turn and bank. Either will work. Technically, gyroscopic rate of turn indicator. Slip skid, that's the ball of your turn coordinator or turn and bank. A sensitive altimeter, one that can be changed with a Colesman window. It's got the little adjustment. You have to have a clock with second hand. By the way, it used to be that you had to have a clock with a second hand, and they didn't allow you to have a digital clock, but they've changed that. So now you can have a digital representation. Although, interestingly enough, you have to have this clock permanently installed in your aircraft, technically, in order to be legal. By the way, if you have a GPS, you have a clock, because every GPS receiver receives the time. So you can always get the time from your GPS. You have to have a source of energy. So an alternator or a generator. Alternators are better, probably already knew that. You need a pitch and bank indicator, basically an AI, and a DG or equivalent. Equivalent means DG or HSI, or if you have a glass panel display, you have an equivalent. Now, you'll notice the only one of our six-pack instruments that's not listed here is the VSI. Now remember, what did you do if your static port got clogged and you didn't have an alternate static? They said, sacrifice that VSI, just bash that thing in, and now you have an alternate static. Why is that? Well, number one, you don't really need it. Number two, it's cheap, so why not? It's the cheaper instrument. Go ahead and sacrifice the cheap one. Also, if you're going to be above 24K, then you need DME, distance measuring equipment. Now, of course, almost nobody has that explicitly anymore, but a IFR certified GPS may be substituted for DME. And if you were to lose DME above 24,000 feet, you can tell ATC and they'll probably let you continue. I know this is not an issue for most of us. Even if you're flying something like a Malibu, its maximum altitude is flight level 250 or 25,000 feet. You might say, why is it 25,000 feet? There are a couple of issues there. There's the maximum pressure differential that the hull can take, but the bigger issue is if it's certified to go above 25,000 feet, then you have to have additional endorsements to fly it. Now you have to have a high altitude endorsement, and Piper didn't want you to have that, so they said, okay, we'll just make it simple, and the maximum allowed altitude for that aircraft is flight level 250. If I was flying at 25,000, lost my DME, and I have to descend 1,000 feet. No biggie. Other things that Rod talks about, oxygen. So oxygen is required if you're above 12.5 for more than 30 minutes. But below 14K, where you need oxygen, and 15K, where you must provide it to your passengers. You can't force them to use it, but you have to provide it. Now, a couple of things I wanted to say about oxygen. At nighttime especially, some pilots, if they have it available, they like to take a couple hits of oxygen, even if they're not flying really high. Also, if you're a smoker, it can raise your effective altitude 5,000 to 7,000 feet. So, another good reason to quit smoking. You can get hypoxic much, much earlier. The other thing is, this is cumulative. If you look at a lot of drop zones, they typically will fly you up to 13,500 feet, even if it's a turboprop. It's very common, typically, the maximum altitude you're going to get. And why is that? Well, because above 14 grand, then the pilot needs oxygen. And that's a pain in the butt, it's an extra expense. Right? And above 15, everybody needs oxygen. And the skydivers need more certifications, blah, 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 blah. Even if you're not going all the way up to 12,500 feet, if you're a jump pilot and you're going up and then down, and up and then down, and up and then down, this does have a cumulative effect on you. Some people say, well, can I go up for 29 minutes and go down and then go back up? Legally, yes, but it's kind of stupid. Right? Don't do that. This does take a toll on you. I can say, if some days it gets really busy, some days I might fly 20 plus loads at the drop zone. And you're pretty tired by the end of the day. It's not just because you've been flying a lot. It's also because of this. Rod also talks about where is a transponder required. You can substitute that with ADS-B now. So as of this date, you need ADS-B all the places where you used to have a transponder. Not going to go through that. Most likely you're going to need it. If you're going into a busy airspace, here at Bloomsburg, yes, you could fly up to 10,000 feet and not have a transponder at all. But if you want to fly down to Allentown, now you need a transponder, which means you also need ADS-B. Fly down to Philly, same thing. Fly above 10,000 feet, same thing. So, can you fly IFR without ADS-B? You can, but it's kind of limiting. Right? VFR is a lot easier to fly without ADS-B today. But of course, you can get a waiver, and there are other things that you can do there if you need. Speaking of things like transponders, one of the last things I want to talk about from this chapter is things like tests. We said that you had to have your 30-day VOR checks. You also need to have your 24-month checks. So every plane, 24 months, you need to have your transponder checked. Interestingly enough, you still need the transponder, even if you have the ADS-B. And you might say, why is that? Well, there's a lot of reasons for it. So they never take away requirements, they just add, right? So transponder, this is everyone. And only for the IFR guys, you have to have your pitot-static and altimeter checked. So very commonly, people will get all of this done at the same place. You can't go to just any A&P or any IA even. I can't legally do this. You actually have to go to a repair station to have these tests done. All right, so that is chapter 8, which is all about the FARs.